Chapter 4. Orsi said you wanted to learn about the world, Meal said. Is that right? The path was too steep and uneven for horses. Even the badly wounded were walking or being carried. Meal was wearing his riding boots. He'd brought ordinary shoes, suitable for walking in, but they'd been in a trunk with the rest of his belongings in the supply train, and he didn't fancy going down the mountain and asking the Mezentines if he could have them back. The boots were extremely good for their intended purpose, which wasn't walking. Close-fitting, thin-soled, and armored with 12 lame steel sabotons attached to the leather with rivets. The heads of those rivets were starting to wear through the pigskin lining and chafe his heels and the arches of his feet, and he could feel every pebble and flint through the soles as he walked. As if that wasn't enough to be going on with, he'd been given the job of being nice to the Mezentine he'd done his best to persuade Orsi to lynch. It could be seen as a backhanded compliment, but Meal wasn't in the mood. If it's no trouble, the Mezentine said. I'm afraid I'm rather ignorant about everything outside the city. Most of us are. I think that's a large part of the problem. Meal shrugged. Same with us, he said. We know exactly as much about your people as we care to. Not the best basis on which to start a war. I guess not. The Mezentine sounded faintly embarrassed to hear a high officer of state implying a criticism of policy. Quite right, too, but it's always galling to be taught good manners by an enemy. The Duchess had rules about that sort of thing. Be specially polite to people who annoy you. True feelings are for true friends. Meal particularly liked that one because it meant you could convert trying situations into a kind of game. The more you disliked a person, the politer you could be. You knew that each civility was really a rude gesture in disguise, and you could therefore insult the victim like mad without him ever knowing. I'm forgetting my manners, Meal said. You only know me as the bloodthirsty bugger who tried to have you killed. I'm Meal Ducas. Ziani Vaatsis. Pleased to meet you. Meal thought for a moment, then frowned. Do all Mezentine names have a Z in them? The Mezentine, no. At least do him the courtesy of thinking of him by his name. Vaatsis grinned. It does seem like that sometimes, he said, but it's not like there's a law or anything. Actually, I believe it's a dialect thing. Back in the country we originally came from, I'd be something like Tiani Badates. A singularly useless piece of information, but there you are. Quite so. What was it Orsi said you did back home? Some kind of blacksmith? Vaatsis laughed. Not really, he said. I was a foreman at the ordnance factory. Fine, what's a foreman? The answer to that, Vaatsis said, depends on who you ask. But basically, I walk up and down the place all day, making sure the workers in each shop are doing the work they're supposed to be doing, and making a proper job of it. A bit like a sergeant in an army, I suppose. I see, Meal said. And had you been doing it long? 6 years. Before that I was a toolmaker. Like I said, Meal put in, a blacksmith. If you like. Actually, my job was to make the jigs and fixtures for the machines that made the various products. It was all about knowing how things work and how to make them do what you want. Well, that sounds more like my job, Meal said. And he realized that he wasn't being nearly as polite as he'd intended. But I'm supposed to be telling you things, not the other way around. What would you like to know? Well, Vaatsis paused. We could start with geography and put in the history where it's relevant, or the other way around, whatever suits you. Geography, all right, here goes. Meal cast his mind back a long way, to vague recollections of maps he'd paid too little attention to when he was a boy. Your city stands at the mouth of a gulf, on the east coast of the continent. On the other 3 sides, you've got plains and marshes, where the rivers drain down from these mountains we're walking up. You'll have observed that the eastern plain where the battle was separates 2 distinct mountain ranges, the north and the south. Arimia Montis is a plateau and a bunch of valleys in the heart of the northern mountains. In the southern range live our closest neighbors and traditional enemies, the Vidani. There's not a lot of difference between us, except for one thing. They're lucky enough to have a massive vein of silver running through the middle of their territory. All we've got is some rather thin grass, sheep, and the best horses in the world. With me so far? I think so, Vaatsis said. Go on. Meal paused for breath. The climb wasn't getting any easier. South of the Vidani, he said, is the desert, and it's a wonderful thing and a blessing, because it forms a natural barrier between us and the people who live in the south. If it wasn't for the desert, we'd have to build a wall, and it would have to be a very high one with big spikes on top. The southerners aren't nice people. I see, Vaatsis said. In what way? Any way you care to name, Meal replied. They're nomadic. Basically, they live by stealing each other's sheep. They're barbaric and cruel, and there's entirely too many of them. If If I tell you we prefer your lot to the Southerners, you may get some idea. Right, Vatsy said. That bad. Absolutely. But like I said, there's 100 miles of desert between them and us, so that's all right. Now then, above us, that's to the north of Arimia Montes, you've got the Curidoce. They're no bother to anybody. I know about them, Vatsy's interrupted. That's where most of our food comes from. Yeah, that's right. They trade wheat and beans and wine and God knows what else for your trinkets and stuff. We sell them wool and horses, and buy their barley and their disgusting beer. To the best of my knowledge, they just sort of go on and on into the distance and fade out. The far north of their territory is all snow and ice, and what's the word for it? Tundra? Till you reach the ocean. I have an idea the better quality of falcons come from up there somewhere, but you'd have to ask my cousin Jarnak about that sort of thing. Anyway, that's geography for you. Thank you, Vatsy said. Can we stop and rest for a minute? We don't have mountains where I come from, just stairs. Of course, Miel said. He'd been walking a little faster than he'd have liked, so as to wear out the effete city type, and his knees were starting to ache. We can't stay too long or we'll get left behind, but a minute or two won't hurt. History? Please. History, Miel said. It's pretty straightforward. 1,000 years ago or something like that, the mountains were more or less empty, and the ancestors of the Arimians and the Vadani were all one people living right down south, other side of the desert. When the nomads arrived, they drove us out. It's one of the reasons why we don't like them very much. Well, we crossed the desert. There's lots of good legends about that, and settled in the mountains. Nothing much happened for a while. Then there was the most terrific falling out between us, meaning the Arimians and the Vadani. Don't ask me what it was all about. But pretty soon, it turned into a civil war. We moved into the North Mountains and started calling ourselves Arimians, and the Civil War stopped being civil and became just plain war. This was long before the silver was discovered, so both sides were pretty evenly matched. And we carried on fighting in a force of habit sort of way for generations. Vatsy's nodded. Like you do, he said. Quite. Then, about 300 years ago, your lot turned up out of the blue, came over the sea in big ships, as you presumably know better than I do. To begin with, our lot and the Vadani were far too busy beating each other up to notice you were there. It was only when your traders started coming up the mountain and selling us things that we realized you were here to stay. No skin off our noses. We were happy to buy all the things you made, and there was always a chance we could drag you in on our side of the war if the Vadani didn't beat us to it. Really, it was only, no offense, only when you people started throwing your weight about, trying to push us around, generally acting like you owned the place, that we actually noticed how big and strong you'd grown. Too late to do anything about it by then, needless to say. When you say throwing our weight about, Miel stood up. We'd better be getting along, or they're going to wonder where we've got to. So throwing your weight about, well, it started with little things. The way it always does. For instance, when your traders arrived, they came to us back then. We didn't have to go traipsing down the mountain to get ripped off by middlemen. Well, the first thing they had a big success with was cloth. Beautiful stuff you people make. Got to hand it to you. Anyhow, we'd say, that's nice, I'll take 12 yards, and the bloke would measure it off with his stick, and we'd go home and find out we hadn't got 12 yards, only 11 and a bit. Really screws it up when you're making clothes and there's not quite enough fabric. So we'd go storming back the next day in a fine old temper, and the trader would explain that the Mezzantine yard is in fact 2 and a smidge inches shorter than the Arimian yard, on account of a yard being a man's stride, and the Arimians have got longer legs. Put like that, you can't object, it's entirely reasonable. Then the trader says, tell you what, to avoid misunderstandings in the future, how'd it be if you people started using our measurements? We'd say we weren't sure about that, and the trader would explain that he buys and sells all over the place, and it would really make life tiresome if he had to keep adapting each time he came to a place that had its own weights and measures. So, being completely practical, it would be far easier for us to change than it would be for him. Also, if he's got to spend time consulting conversion charts or cutting special sticks for Arimian yards, well, that time it'd have to be paid for, meaning a 5 or 10% rise in prices to cover additional costs and overheads. Naturally, we said, fine, we'll use your yard instead of ours. Next was weights, because there's 18 ounces in the Arimian pound, and then it was the gallon. Next it was the calendar, because a couple of our months are a few days shorter, so we'd arranged to meet your people on such and such a day, and you wouldn't show up. You get the idea, I'm sure. Didn't take long before everything was being weighed and measured in the Mezzantine units. which meant a whole lot of us didn't have a clue how much of anything we were buying or how much it was really costing us or even what day of the week it was. Sure, all just little things, one step at a time, like a man walking to the gallows. But the time came when we stopped making our own cloth because yours was cheaper and better. Same for all the things we got from you. Then out of the blue the price had shot right up, we'd complain, and then it's take it or leave it. We've got plenty of customers, but you've only got the one supplier. So we gave in, started paying the new prices. But when we tried to even things up by asking more for what we had to sell, butter and wool and so forth, it's a whole different story. Next step, your people are interfering in every damn thing. The Duke appoints someone to do a job, your traders turn around and say, we can't work with him, he doesn't like us, choose someone else. And by the way, here's a list of other things you do which we don't approve of. If you want to carry on doing business with us, you'd better change your ways. We're about to tell you where you can stick your manufactured goods when suddenly we realize that your people have been quietly buying up chunks of our country, land, live and dead stock, water rights, you name it. Investment, I believe it's called. And by a bizarre coincidence, you use the same word for besieging a castle. So there we were, invested on all sides. We can't tell you to go and screw yourselves without getting your permission first, throwing your weight around. Vatsi's frowned. I see, he said. Honestly, I had no idea. Come to that, before I ran away from the city, I didn't even know you existed. Oh, your lot know we exist, all right, Emil sighed. Give you an example. My family, the Duckus, have been landowners in big fish and little ponds, and selfless servants of the Commonwealth for longer than even we can remember. We've done our bit for our fellow citizens, believe me. About a third of the men in the Duckus over the last 500 years have died in war, either killed in a battle or gone down with dysentery or infected wounds. We pay more in tax than any other family. In our corner of the country, we run the justice system. We're the land and probate registry. We say the magic words at the weddings of our tenants. We're godfathers to their children. We run schools and pay for doctors. We take the view that a tenant deserves to get more for his rent than just a strip of land and a side to be on when there's a feud. That's what I was talking about when I said we do our bit for our fellow citizens. And that's over and above stuff like fighting in wars and being chancellors and ambassadors and commissioners. Do you see what I'm driving at? Vatsi's nodded. You're the government, he said. But it's different in the city, of course. The big men who do all the top jobs in the guilds are our government. But they get to make policy, not just carry it out. They can decide what's going to be done, and of course that means they have loads of opportunities to look out for their own guilds or their neighbors and families or themselves. You can only do what the Duke tells you. You've got all the work, but without the privileges and perks. That's right, Emil said. Well, you've certainly got a grasp of politics. Like I said, I know how things work. A city or a country is just a kind of machine. It's got a mechanism. I can see mechanisms at a glance, like people who can douse for water. That's quite a gift, Emil said, frowning slightly. Anyway, the way we've always done things is for the landowning families to be the government, as you call it. But then along come you city people, investors, buying up land in flocks and slices of our lives. And of course, they don't take responsibility the way we've been brought up to. They don't think, how will such and such a decision affect the tenants and their shepherds or the people of the village? They don't live here, and when they make a decision, they're guided by what's best for their investment. What'll produce the best profit, or whatever it is that motivates them. So when two tenants fall out over a boundary or grazing rights or a common or anything like that, they can't do what they've always done, go and see the boss up at the big house and make him sort it out for them. The boss isn't there, and even if they were to go all the way to Mezentia and ask to see the directors of the company or whatever such people call themselves, and even though if those directors could be bothered to see them and listen to them, it wouldn't do any good because they wouldn't understand a thing about the situation. Not like we would, the Duckus or the Orphanotrophy or the Focus. See, we're their boss, but we're also their neighbor. They can go out of their front door and look up the mountain and see our houses. You can't see Mezentia's guild hall from anywhere in Aremia. Vaatsis nodded. He seemed to be an intelligent man, and quite reasonable. Perhaps that was why they'd put him in prison. Emil decided. I guess it's a question of attitude, Emil said. Perspective. Damn it. That was the other way around. That was what Ziani said. We're concerned mostly with things, making them, selling them, but you're concerned with people. Emil smiled. That puts it very well, he said. And maybe you can see why I don't like your city. I've gone off it rather myself, Vaatsi said. Fine, Emil nodded. So perhaps you'd care to explain to me why you think it would be a good idea to turn my country into a copy of it? It was a neat piece of strategy, Emil couldn't help but thinking. He'd have derived more satisfaction from it if he'd found it easier to dislike the mezzanine, but that was hard going, like running uphill, and the further he went the harder it got. But he'd laid his trap and sprung it. There was one mechanism the mezzanine hadn't figured out at a glance, and sure enough, for a while Vaatsi seemed to be lost for words. "It's not quite like that," he said eventually. "Like I told you, I'm an engineer. I know about machines, things." He frowned thoughtfully. "Let's see," he said. "Suppose you come to me and ask me to build you a machine, a loom, say, so you can weave your wool into cloth instead of sending it down the mountain." "Right," Emil said. "So I build the machine," Vaatsis went on, "and I deliver, and I get it paid. That's my side of the bargain. What you do with it, how you use it, and how the use you put it to affects your life and your neighbors, that's your business, not my business. And not my fault. It'd be the same if you asked me to build you a scorpion. An arrow thrower. Once you've taken it from me, it's up to you what you point it at. You can use it to defend your country or your way of life against your worst enemy, or you can set it up on the turret of your castle and shoot your neighbors. All I want to do," he went on, "is make a new life for myself, now that the old one's been taken away from me. Now I'm lucky because I know a secret. It's like I can turn lead into gold. If I can do that, it'd be pretty silly of me to get a job mucking out pigs. From your point of view, I can give you the secrets that make the mezzanine stronger than you are. With that power, you've got a chance of making sure you don't have to go through another horrible disaster like the one you've just suffered. Now," he went on, stopping for a moment to catch his breath, "if I were to sell you a scorpion without telling you how it works, or how to use it safely without hurting yourself, well, that'd be no good. But that's not the case. You seem to understand just fine what's wrong with the city and how it works. I can give you the secret, and you know enough not to hurt yourself with it, or spoil all the good things about your own way of life. Does that make any sense to you?" It was a long time before Emil answered. "Yes, actually it does," he said. "And that's why I'm glad it's not my decision about whether we take you up on your offer. If it was up to me, I'd probably say yes now that we've had this conversation, and I have a feeling that would be a bad thing." "Oh," Vaatsi said. "Why?" "Now, if I knew that I'd be all right. Emil smiled suddenly. "See, I'd be safe, see, but it's all academic since it's not up to me." Vaatsi scratched his head. "I don't know," he said. "You're a senior officer of state, so if you went to the Duke and said, 'For God's sake, don't let that mezzanine start teaching us his diabolical tricks,' well, he'd listen to you, wouldn't he?" "You were there when I told him to have you hanged," Emil replied cheerfully, "and here you still are." "Yeah, but you didn't press the point. I was there, remember? It's not like you made any effort to use your influence, and when he said, 'No, let's not,' you didn't argue." He lifted his eyes and looked at Emil. "Are you sorry you didn't?" "Like I said, it wasn't my decision. It never is." "Would you like it to be?" Emil shivered, as though he'd just touched a plate he didn't realize was hot. "We're falling behind," he said. "Come on, don't dawdle." They walked quickly, past men supporting their wounded friends on their shoulders, others hauling ropes or pushing the wheels of carts over the rims of potholes. "Of course," Emil said abruptly, "if he decides to let you teach us, common courtesy requires that we teach you something in return." "Does it?" "Oh, yes. Reciprocity is courtesy. There's an old family rule of the Duchess. We pay our debts in kind." "Really? We've got money for that." Emil shook his head. "That's wages," he said. "And wages are a political statement. If I pay you, that makes you my servant. It's a different sort of relationship. Between gentlemen, it's a gift for a gift, and a favor for a favor." "I see," Vaatsi said. "So if you teach me something in return, that's instead of money." "Of course not. You're missing the point. I'm a nobleman, and you're whatever you said, a foreman. Therefore, courtesy demands that I give more than I get." Vaatsi's thought about that. "To show you're better than me." "That's it. That's what nobility is all about. If you want to be better than someone socially, you've got to be better than them in real terms too. More gracious, more forbearing, whatever. Otherwise, all that transaction between us proves is that I'm more powerful than you, and that wouldn't say anything about me. Hence the need for me to give more than I get. It's simple, really." There was a pause, while Vaatsis thought that one through. So I get the money and something else. Yes. Well, in that case, fine. You have to teach me something. That's right. Thanks, Vaatsis said. Thanks very much. So what do you know that you could teach me? Ah, Meal grins. That's a slight problem. Let's see, what do I know? Another thing about nobility, he continued, is that you don't actually know many things. You just know a few things very well indeed. I could teach you statesmanship. Meaning what? How to debate in high council, Meal said. How to budget and cost a project. How to forecast future revenues. Negotiation with foreign ambassadors. Court protocol. That sort of thing. Vaatsis frowned. Not a lot of use to me, really. I suppose not. So what does that leave? Estate management? No, not particularly relevant. I think we're just left with horsemanship, falconry, and fencing. Right, Vaatsis said. All three of which I know nothing about. Which would you say is easiest? None of them. In that case, falconry or fencing. Horses give me a rash. Meal laughed. Maybe I'll teach you both, he said. But it'll all depend on what Orsi decides. Vaatsis nodded. You've known him a long time, I think. All my life, we grew up together. 20 or so of us, hanging around the court. Back then, of course, he was just the Orsioli and I was the Duchess. But we always got on well nonetheless. Surprising, since my father was right up on the top of the tree and the Orsioli were sort of clinging frantically to the lower branches. But then Orsi married the Countess Siropati, and she's got no brothers and her sisters aren't eligible for some technical reason, so they got married off outside the duchy. As a result, Orsi was suddenly the heir apparent. Count Siropat dies, Orsi becomes the duke. Couldn't have happened to a nicer fellow either. So you don't mind? Mind? Of course not. Oh, I see you're thinking I might have been resentful because he got to be the duke. Not a bit of it. The Siropati would never marry the Duchess. Vaatsis looked puzzled. But I thought your family were high-ranking aristocrats. We are, which is the reason. Quite simple, really. The great houses aren't allowed to marry into the ruling family, otherwise there'd be no end of god-awful power struggles, with all of us trying to get the throne, so we're all excluded. Stops us getting any dangerous ideas. If the duke's only got daughters, he has to find his heir from the lesser nobility, people like the Orsioli. It's a good system. But you should have figured that all out for yourself, if you've got a special intuition for how things work. Well, I know now, Vaatsis said. I guess I didn't figure it out for myself because it's a good idea, and those don't seem to happen much in politics. Who made the rule, anyhow? That struck Meal as a strange question. We all did, he said. Gradually, over time. I don't think anybody ever just sat down with a piece of paper and wrote the rules out just so. They grew because everybody could see it made sense. An intuitive feel for how things work, Vaatsis said. Maybe there's hope for you people after all. That night, they camped in a small valley under a false peak. They didn't start pitching tents until sunset, and most of the work was done by torchlight. Tired men doing things they knew by heart, cooperating smoothly and without thinking, like the components of a properly run-in machine. It was probably a good sign that Ziani was given a guest tent all to himself, a small one with a plain camp bed, a lamp, and an old iron brazier. But he didn't have to share, and they put it up for him rather than telling him where it was and leaving him to it. When he was alone, he sat up in the bed. He ached all over from the exhaustion of walking uphill all day. His heels and soles were covered in torn blisters, and his new shoes were smudged inside with blood. And he stared at the boundary where the circle of yellow light touched the white canvas background. Having that sort of mind, he drew up a schedule of resources, a list of materials and components. First he had his life. In the guild hall, and after that on the road, in the plain, on the terrifying outskirts of the battle, he'd recognized the inevitability of his own death, without finding any way to reconcile himself to it. For many reasons, but one primarily, he couldn't accept it. Death was a part that didn't fit, something that had no place in the scheme of things as they should be, an abomination. He had no illusions about his escape. He didn't believe in destiny, any more than he believed in goblins. If the iron ore was destined to end up as finished products, there'd be no need for an engineer. There had been a certain amount of resourcefulness and clever thinking involved, but mostly it was luck, particularly once he was away from people and under the impersonal, inhuman sky. He's always hated nature. It was a machine too big for him to take in, too specialized for him to repair. But he'd had his life, the essential starting point. Can't get anything done if you're dead. Next, he had his knowledge and his trade. Many years ago, he'd come to accept the fact that he was completely and exclusively defined by what he did. Other men were tall or short, strong or weak, kind or cruel, clever or stupid. They were funny, popular, reliable, feckless, miserable. They were lovers or runners or storytellers, borers, growers of prize roses, readers, collectors of antique candlesticks. They were friends, neighbors, enemies, evil bastards, compassionate, selfless, generous. Ziani Vaatzis was an engineer. Everything he was, all he was. When he came home in the evening, yes, finally he had his motivation. He had, of course, lied to the Duke and the Duke's pleasant, slow-witted courtier. If it hadn't been for his motivation, he'd have stayed in the prison cell, or curled up in a ball on the moors and died. He certainly wouldn't have killed 2 men, and he certainly wouldn't be getting ready to betray his city's most precious secrets to the barbarians. He'd considered setting his motivation down in the list of problems and obstacles, since it was such an incredible burden, limiting his actions in so many ways. But in spite of that, it was an asset, and the best facility at his disposal. He saw it, in the blueprint in his mind, as the engine that would power his machine. Certainly nothing else could. As for that list of problems and obstacles, in the end, it did him a service by putting him to sleep, because it stretched on endlessly, like the sheep you're supposed to count jumping over the gap in the wall. There were so many of them, it was almost a relief. So many, he didn't have to bother listing them. It couldn't be done. The way to cross a vast flat plain when you're aching, starving, and exhausted is not to resolve to get to the other side, because that's out of the question. You don't look to the mountains, a little gray blip at the bottom of the sky. You look ahead and make a bet with yourself. I bet I'll get as far as that little outcrop of boulders, or that single thorn tree, before I fall over and die. If you win that bet, you double up on the next one, and so on, until at last you can't trick yourself into taking another step, at which point a defeated enemy army, which just happens to be passing, picks you up and rescues you. Piece of cake, really. Similarly, he made a point of not looking at the end result he needed to achieve. It was too far away, and there were too many obstacles. He'd never live to reach it. But he might just make it as far as the first step in his design, the second, possibly even the third, same as a big project in the factory. You know you'll never get it done in one day, so you plan it out. Today we'll cut the material. Tomorrow we'll face off and mark out. The next day we'll trim the diameter, cut the threads, and so on. It complicated things a little that his motivation and his objective were so closely linked because they were so simple. But it's good design to make one part carry out 2 functions. If he couldn't let himself believe in it, he couldn't very well rely on it to drive him forward across the heather and the tussocks of couch grass. Fortunately, he found he could turn a blind eye to the inconsistency. The motivation was strong enough to keep him going, even though the objective was so ridiculously far-fetched. All he had to do, it was so simple. To a man who lived by and for complexities, all he had to do was close his eyes and think of her. And he was like the flywheel driven by the belt, whether it likes it or not. The next day was all uphill, and Meal was needed to supervise the carts and the wounded and various other things that had got slightly worse overnight. It didn't help that Orsi was insisting he was strong enough to ride. It wasn't fair on the doctor, for one thing. The wretched man had enough to do with several hundred critical cases who weren't dukes, but who did do what they were told, without having to stay within earshot of His Highness in case the partially healed wound burst and the idiot needed to be seen straight away before he bled to death. I can manage, really, Meal told his oldest friend. I know that, Orsi replied, shifting painfully in his saddle, but you shouldn't have to. This is my responsibility. You look like death warmed up. Thank you so much, Meal winced, as though he wanted to ride away in a huff, but knew he wasn't allowed to, because it would be discourteous. Look, it's no big deal. If I can just get a few tangles straightened out, we can be on our way, and it'll be fine. It'll be much quicker for me to deal with the problems myself than explain what they are so you can handle them. And, he added, with the air of a general committing his last reserves in a final reckless charge, the doctor says you won't be fit to ride for another 3 days. Orsi made a remark about the doctor that was both vulgar and inaccurate. Besides, he went on, if it's my health you're all worried about, you ought to realize that if I've got to spend another day alone in that cart brooding about what a fuck I've made of everything, it's absolutely guaranteed I'll die of guilt and frustration. So telling me what the doctor said isn't just annoying and a high treason, it's counterproductive. Meal sighed melodramatically. Not up to me, he said. If you want to risk a massive hematoma... You mean hemorrhage, Orsi pointed out. Hematoma is bruises. Trust me, all right? Well, let's talk about something else. How's that cousin of yours getting on? Jarnak. He stopped himself abruptly. Meal smiled. It's all right, he said. Jarnak wasn't killed in the battle. In fact, he didn't join the army at all. Stayed home. Sensible chap. Meal frowned. No, actually, Cousin Jarnak doesn't approve of the war. He thinks it's wrong. And I don't mean wrong as in liable to end up a complete fiasco. Wrong as in morally bad. All wars, not just this one. Orsi nodded. There's a word for that, isn't there? I can think of several. No, I mean, it's a known about thing, an ism. Pacifism. Is that right? Meal yawned. There's times when my cousin gets so far up my nose he's practically poking out of my ear. Why did you mention him all of a sudden? Don't know, Orsi said. Or rather, yes, I do. I was lying there, awake in the early hours, and for some reason I was remembering that sparrowhawk he had when we were kids. Mad keen on falconry he was back then. Yeah, still is. Why, do you fancy going hawking when we get home? I'm sure he'd be glad of the excuse to show off. Well, it might be fun, Orsi said, though God knows I shouldn't even be thinking of swanning about enjoying myself when there's so much work to be done. Besides, what would people think? There goes the Duke having a day off, Meal replied. You aren't the first man in history who's lost a battle. It wasn't your fault, not really. No, really. You weren't to know about those scorpion things if it hadn't been for them. Which is like saying if it wasn't for the rain it'd be a dry day, Orsi scowled. Sooner or later, you'll have to admit it, Meal. I screwed up. I led thousands of our people to their death. Meal sighed loudly. All right, yes, it's very bad, and it's going to be very tense for a while back home until people come to terms with it. But these things happen. And you know what? It's not you they're going to hate, it's the Mezzantines, because they're the ones who killed our people. Now, do you want me to organize a day with the birds when we get home or not? Orsi shook his head. Best not, he said. At least not for a while. Now, what can I do to help? Eventually, Meal let him organize the reconnaissance parties. That was all right. He was happy with that. They were, he knew, in sensitive territory. Not far away. Nobody was entirely sure where, that was the problem, was the border between the two mountain dukedoms. He felt confident that the Vidani wouldn't make trouble unless they felt they were provoked. Straying inadvertently onto their land with an army, however, even if that army was a chewed-up remnant, would probably constitute provocation, particularly to some of the old-school Vidani commanders who were still having trouble coming to terms with the peace. Vital, therefore, to keep a sharp eye open for routine border patrols and to keep well out of their way. The scout captains duly set off, and he settled down in the vanguard to wait for the first reports. The Vidani, he thought, that's probably what made me think about falcons and Jarnak Ducas. It had been years since he'd seen his cousin Valens. The last time, come to think of it, was before either of them had come to the throne, before his wedding even. He tried to picture Valens in his mind, and saw a thin, sharp-nosed, sullen boy who never spoke first. He remembered feeling sorry for him, watching him ride to the hunt with his outrageous father. It had been a cold, miserable occasion, a state visit, reception, and grand battue, to celebrate a truce in the unending, insoluble war. It was obvious that nobody on either side believed in the truce. They were all proved right a few months later when it collapsed into bloody shambles, and hardly anybody made any effort to mask skepticism. But they'd attended the reception, watched the dancers, listened to the musicians, gone through the motions with fixed smiles. And then that dreadful day's hunting in the cold mist, everybody getting muddled about the directions, not hearing the horns, getting to their pegs too early or too late. The old Duke in a raging temper because the beaters had gone in before they were supposed to, and the deer had been fleshed and gone on, long before the guests were in position. Not that any of the Aremian contingent cared a damn, but the Duke did, because he actually cared about whether they caught anything or not. Some of the Aremians reckoned the visit and the whole truce business was just a pretext he'd cooked up for a full-scale battue at the beginning of the season. As a result, the Duke spent the day charging backward and forward across the field, yelling at huntsmen and line captains, and young Valens had charged with him, grimly wretched but keeping up, so as not to get lost and add to the day's problems. It was painfully obvious that he didn't want to be there. Obvious that his father knew it and didn't care. He took his son with him the way you'd wear a brooch or a belt you hated, but which a relative had given you, so you had to wear it so as not to hurt their feelings. That day he'd felt very sorry for Valens, and it was still the mental image his mind defaulted to when his advisors debated the Vidani question in council, or when his wife talked about Valens to him. It's hard to hate someone who, in your mind, is forever a sad 12-year-old, soaked wet on a horse far too big for him. Orsi, of course, made a point of never hating anybody unless it was absolutely unavoidable. The first party of scouts hadn't seen anything. The second party reported a body of horsemen, apparently shadowing the army on the other side of a hog's back. Somewhere between 75 and 120 of them, a third or half squadron, therefore quite possibly a routine patrol. The third party were late, and when they came in, they had a shamefaced look about them. They'd been intercepted by Vadani cavalry, who'd apparently materialized out of thin air in front of them on the road, and given them a message to take back. Duke Valens sent his greetings and sympathy on their unfortunate experience. It occurred to him that the army might be short of food, clothes, doctors, and whatever. If there was anything they needed, anything the Vadani could do to help, except, of course, military action of any kind, all they had to do was ask. Orsi's first instinct was to refuse. While he was trying to come up with a sufficiently polite form of words, he found himself wondering why. True, it would be galling to be in Valen's debt. But food, at least a dozen more doctors, best of all a guide or two to show them the easiest way, well, that could be enough to save lives. He sent a reply thanking Valens very much indeed, and listing everything he could think of. The offer wasn't kindly meant, he had no illusions on that score, but he was in no position to take account of intentions. The Vadani doctors came, with the supply wagons, perched among sacks and barrels and wearing bemused, scared expressions, like helpless peasants abducted by fairies. Maybe the Vadani told the same sorts of stories about the Aremians as Orsi had heard about them during the war. They can't be trusted, don't take prisoners, they string you up by the ankles and use you for javelin practice. At any rate, they seemed anxious to help and please, and the Vadani had always had a good reputation for medicine. Orsi amused himself by wondering where they'd been press-ganged from. They'd arrived so fast. They could hardly have been given time to grab their boots and their bags. They asked permission to take some of the worst cases away with them. These men need proper care in a hospital and so forth. But he couldn't allow that. If there was one thing the Vadani were better at than curing people, it was taking hostages. Once or twice, as the day wore on, he caught himself thinking about the Mezzantine fugitive and his extraordinary offer. But that would have to wait until he got home. The decision would have to be taken in the proper way, with the opinions of the council guiding him. Better, therefore, that he kept his mind open and didn't think about it at all till then. They stopped for the night an hour before sunset, a long way short of where they'd hoped to reach. This journey was taking forever. Orsi was tired but not exhausted, and his wound hadn't burst like everyone said it would. There was a little blood showing through the bandage, but nothing spectacular. A Vadani doctor came to examine and dress it. A short, stout man with a fringe of straight white hair around a glowing bald head, very quiet, as though each word was costing him 30 shillings. Orsi guessed that it was the first time he'd had anything to do with the effects of a battle. Some people reacted like that, shutting the doors and windows of their minds to keep the intrusive information out. He said the wound was knitting very well, tutted to himself with the cack-handed Aremian way of winding a bandage, and left quickly. When he'd gone, Orsi poured himself a small drink and opened the book he'd brought along to read and hadn't yet looked at. Pesenia Elastra's Sonnets, the latest recension, an anniversary present from his wife. He opened it to the first page, laid it carefully face down on his knee, and burst into tears.